mimosa scrub. The bullets pattered all over the decks, but while many recorded narrow escapes, no one was actually hit, and the Maxim guns, revolving quickly on their pivots, took a bloody vengeance for the surprise. The flotilla then steamed slowly past the town, and, having thoroughly reconnoitred it, turned about and ran downstream, again exchanging shells with the Dervish artillery. All firing ceased at 2:30, but 6 sailing boats containing grain were captured on the return voyage, and with these the gunboats retired in triumph to a small island 6 miles north of Metemma, where they remained for the night. It being now known that bombarding the Dervishes was no less enjoyable than exciting, it was determined to spend another day with them, and at 4 o'clock the next morning the flotilla again steamed southward, so as to be in position opposite Metemma before daylight. Fire was opened on both sides with the dawn, and it was at once evident that the Dervishes had not been idle during the night. It appeared that on the previous day Mahmud had expected a land attack from the direction of Gakdul, and had placed part of his artillery and nearly all his army in position to resist it. But as soon as he was convinced that the gunboats were unsupported, he moved several of the landward guns into the river forts, and even built 2 new works, so that on the 17th the Dervishes brought into action 11 guns, firing from 8 small round forts. The gunboats, however, contented themselves with keeping at a range at which their superior weapons enabled them to strike without being struck, and so, while inflicting heavy loss on their enemies, sustained no injury themselves. After 4 hours' methodical and remorseless bombardment, Commander Keppel considered the reconnaissance complete, and gave the order to retire downstream. The Dervish gunners, elated in spite of their losses by the spectacle of the retreating vessels, redoubled their fire, and continued hurling shell after shell in defiance down the river until their adversaries were far beyond their range. As the gunboats floated northward, their officers, looking back towards Metemma, saw an even stranger scene than the impotent but exulting forts. During the morning a few flags and figures had been distinguished moving about the low range of sandhills near the town, and as soon as the retirement of the flotilla began, the whole of the Dervish army, at least 10,000 men, both horse and foot, and formed in an array more than a mile in length, marched triumphantly into view, singing, shouting, and waving their banners amid a great cloud of dust. It was their only victory. The loss on the gunboats was limited to the single Soudanese soldier, who died of his wounds, and a few trifling damages. The Arab slaughter is variously estimated, one account rating it at 1,000 men, but half that number would probably be no exaggeration. The gunboats fired in the 2 days' bombardment 650 shells and several thousand rounds of Maxim gun ammunition. They then returned to Berber, reporting fully on the enemy's position and army. As soon as Berber had been strongly occupied by the Egyptian troops, Osman Digna realised that his position at Adarama was not only useless but very dangerous. Mahmud had long been imperiously summoning him to join the forces at Metemma, and although he hated the Kordofan general and resented his superior authority, the wary and cunning Osman decided that in this case it would be convenient to obey and make a virtue of necessity. Accordingly, about the same time that the gunboats were making their first reconnaissance and bombardment of Metemma, he withdrew his 2,000 Hadendoa from Adarama, moved along the left bank of the Atbara until the tongue of desert between the rivers became sufficiently narrow for it to be crossed in a day, and so made his way by easy stages to Shundi. When the Sirdar heard of the evacuation of Adarama, he immediately determined to assure himself of the fact, to reconnoitre the unmapped country in that region, and to destroy any property that Osman might have left behind him. On the 23rd of October, therefore, a flying column started from Berber under the command of General Hunter, and formed as follows: 11th Soudanese, Major Jackson, 2 guns, 1 company of the Camel Corps, and Abdul Azim and 150 irregulars. Lightly equipped, and carrying the supplies on a train of 500 camels, the small force moved rapidly along the Nile, and reached the post at the confluence on the 24th, and arrived at Adarama on the 29th, after a journey of 84 miles. The report that Osman Digna had returned to the Nile proved to be correct. His former headquarters were deserted, and although a patrol of 60 of the Camel Corps and the Arab irregulars scouted for 40 miles further up the river, not a single Dervish was to be seen. Having thus collected a great deal of negative information, and delaying only to burn Adarama to the ground, the column returned to Berber. It was now November. The Nile was falling fast, and an impassable rapid began to appear at Tiur, 4 miles north of the confluence. The Sirdar had a few days in which to make up his mind whether he would keep his gunboats on the upper or lower reach. As in the latter case their patrolling limits would have been restricted, and they would no longer have been able to watch the army at Metemma, he determined to leave them on the enemy's side of the obstruction. This involved the formation of a depot at Dakhila, the Atbara fort, where simple repairs could be executed and wood and other necessities stored. To guard this little dockyard, half the 3rd Egyptian Battalion was moved from Berber and posted in a small entrenchment. The other half battalion followed in a few weeks. The post at the confluence was gradually growing into the great camp of a few months later. A regular system of gunboat patrolling was established on the upper reach, and on the 1st of November the Zafir, Nasser, and Metemma, under Commander Keppel, again steamed south to reconnoitre Mahmud's position. The next day they were joined by the Fateh, and on the 3rd the 3 larger boats ran the gauntlet of the forts. A brisk artillery duel ensued, but the Dervish aim was, as usual, erratic, and the vessels received no injury. It was observed that the position of the Dervish force was unchanged, but that 3 new forts had been constructed to the south of the town. The gunboats continued on their way and proceeded as far as Wad Habeshi. The Arab cavalry kept pace with them along the bank, ready to prevent any landing. Having seen all there was to be seen, the flotilla returned and again passed the batteries at Metemma. But this time they were not unscathed, and a shell struck the Fateh, slightly wounding 3 men. No other incident enlivened the monotony of November. The Khalifa continued his defensive preparations. Mahmud remained motionless at Metemma, and although he repeatedly begged to be allowed to advance against the force near Berber, he was steadily refused, and had to content himself with sending raiding parties along the left bank of the Nile, and collecting large stores of grain from all the villages within his reach. Meanwhile the railway was stretching further and further to the south, and the great strain which the sudden occupation of Berber had thrown upon the transport was to some extent relieved. The tranquillity which had followed the advance to Berber was as opportune as it was unexpected. The Sirdar, delighted that no evil consequences had followed his daring move, and finding that he was neither attacked nor harassed in any way, journeyed to Kassala to arrange the details of its retrocession. The convenient situation of Kassala, almost equally distant from Omdurman, Berber, Suakin, Massowa, and Rosaires, and the fertility of the surrounding region raise it to the dignity of the most important place in the eastern Sudan. The soil is rich, the climate, except in the rainy season, not unhealthy. A cool night breeze relieves the heat of the day, and the presence of abundant water at the depth of a few feet below the surface supplies the deficiency of a river. In the year 1883 the population is said to have numbered more than 60,000. The Egyptians considered the town of sufficient value to require a garrison of 3,900 soldiers. A cotton mill adequately fitted with machinery and a factory chimney gave promise of the future development of manufacture. A regular revenue attested the existence of trade. But disasters fell in heavy succession on the eastern Sudan, and blighted the prosperity of its mud metropolis. In 1885, after a long siege and a stubborn resistance, Kassala was taken by the Dervishes. The garrison were massacred